Well, Curt, I've had such a good time watching your film, Better Left Unsaid. I mean, I'm always on the hunt for good material to help explain, let's call it, critical social justice ideology, kind of movement that we're seeing through a lot of the institutions in America and beyond today. And done in a kind of thoughtful and nonpartisan manner. I think you've kind of checked all the boxes here, it's a film that I think I would recommend to absolutely anybody who wants to understand this whole phenomenon and the current social moment. Let's start here, though. Tell me briefly, what is this film? What is the conception of this film in your mind?
It seems clear that there's a political left. It seems clear there's a political right. Then it also seems clear, or at least intuitively clear to most people, that there's extremism. We've explored extremist right movements ad nauseum in the media. Seems like that's all you can read about on Twitter and the major media institutions. Okay, but what about extremism on the left? Does it exist? My question is, well, what is it? Some people would say it's when the left commits violence. However, something leads to that violence. Ideas lead to violence. So which ideas? What ideologically, as much as I don't like to use that word, what ideologically is it that separates the left, the reasonable left, which I say exists, from the unreasonable left or the extreme left?
So in the film, you've also managed to, connect with a lot of very insightful people who are doing commentary on the current social moment and this ideology that you're exploring. So how did this all come about?
Honestly, Jan, I just reached out to them. I just emailed them. I was surprised Noam Chomsky got back to me. And as soon as I got Noam, well, plenty of other people followed. There were people who initially said no. And then I said, by the way, Noam came on. And then they're like, okay, yeah, I'll come on now. So it was as simple as reaching out to people. And just as an aside, I reached out to just as many people on the extreme left as I did on the non-radical side. And I think I got 2 yeses or so, or 3 yeses on the radical side. And then a slew of yeses. Almost everyone said yes on the non-radical side. The reason why, if you watch the movie, there doesn't seem to be as many. It doesn't seem to be proportional. There's way more non-radical voices than there are radical. That's just because they said no, or they just didn't get back to me.
So it was something that happened on campus, or something that or just your whole experience of being a student in the not too distant past that kind of gave rise to this idea to make an actual film?
No, I was just thinking about this idea, and then I put it out on Reddit, and I wanted to know, is there a documentary that explores what happened in Soviet Russia and in China and in Cambodia and so on and so on? Is there a film like this? And people said no, not one that's not propagandistic. I mean, there are some from the 70s and 80s produced primarily by the US government itself, but there didn't seem to be any great catalogs, historical catalogs. So I thought, how about I do this historical inventory myself?
So what does what happened in China and Cambodia and these other places have to do with what's happening on campus?
Listen, that's a tough question, man. It seems like the through line is class guilt. It seems like that's pretty much it. That we can evaluate you not as you, but as your membership. And you've heard this plenty and plenty. It's a refrain now. You're a membership of a class. Sorry, you're a member of a class. So class membership. And then whatever I evaluate the class as, I evaluate you as. There are plenty of philosophical justifications for this, like Marxism. There's a bit of Hegel in there, so Marx took from Hegel. And not that Hegel is wrong wholesale, but I'm just saying there's plenty of Hegel, there's plenty of Freud, there's plenty of postmodernism, as you've heard. So there's plenty of philosophical justifications for why they're able to, when I say they, let's give a name to this. I'll give a name. I'll say the radical left, and I don't want to denigrate. I think that's a large part of our problem, is that we tend to denigrate one of the sides, especially the side that is not us, especially if we see ourselves as part of a side, which I also think is an issue. But many of them self-identify as radical left, and hey, they're big on self-identification, so it doesn't seem like a huge deal to call it the radical left.
So, very briefly, can you chart me through your kind of progression of the film or the vision for it?
Sure. I'll do so linearly. So in the beginning, what I explore, it's actually chronological. What the heck is going on? Part in my mind was, how can I explain these abstract ideas, such as postmodernism, Marxism, psychoanalysis I didn't explore explicitly, but that's underneath. How can I explain these ideas to someone like my mom who has no university training, no idea about any of this? What's happened in the past 10 years or so seems to have only increased. Now, what is it? Well, one is we've seen that there's been a redefinition of terminology. So racism is redefined to mean old racism plus power. And it's not as if this switch has been made explicit. So many of the people from my mother's generation, they would hear that, oh, the society's racist and people in the university believe that. I guess it must be true. Those are brilliant people. But my mom doesn't know that they're operating on a different definition. There are other redefinitions. We go through a plethora in the film itself. Then we go through, well, what's happened historically? So it takes a turn back. Then is there a connection between what's happened historically as to what's happening now in modern times? And then the question is, well, where may it lead? And then the question which I'm extremely interested in is, well, what led us here? And that gets into the problem or the solution of values.
Well, and so I guess I have to ask, what led us here?
See, this is a tough question. People want to be mollycoddled and cosseted. It seems like that's a human instinct. We want someone else to take care of us. And it seems like what's happening is that the radical left, and I'm using that, like we mentioned, I'm putting that in quotations, the radical left ideas are justifications, socially acceptable justifications. They're like tools that can be used to make the problem, whatever the problem is, not theirs. So it removes personal culpability for, let's say, not being as grateful as one could be, or the travails in one's personal life or travails in society, and not taking that on and saying it's my issue, I'm to blame, and instead blaming someone else. So I would say that this has a large factor of wanting to blame someone else rather than blaming oneself. And it's actually extremely, extremely, extremely difficult to blame oneself.
So I want to talk a little bit more about kind of your motivation here of making the film. You obviously were a student, and did you experience this critical social justice ideology on campus? Is this what kind of sparked your interest?
That's not, it more like annoyed me on campus. In fact, there was a show, I used to have a club called UTTV, University of Toronto Television, and there was a few shows that I did, and one episode had to get pulled because I overstepped my bounds when it comes to political correctness. I remember being annoyed by that. And then I graduated, so okay, cool, I'm no longer a part of that. But then you see it encroaching in the culture and increasing. It's more than just annoying, it seems to be affecting law. I think I just read YouTube is going to ban anti-vaccination articles or anti-vaccination videos. What? Now it sounds like that has nothing to do with the radical left. Well, as soon as you allow for something, so in one instance to happen, then the generalization of it can happen. So as soon as you allow, for example, as soon as you allow Google to say, well, we're going to ban racist content and anything that's racist adjacent, well, then you've allowed them to ban, and that you've set precedents. This is what it means to set precedents. And now it's not as if they go backward. It's not as if they say, well, okay, we had to do that temporarily, and now we're going to allow for more liberties. As far as I can tell, historically, even with the Patriot Act, it's not as if the government has stopped tapping our phones, and we're no longer at war with Saddam, or we're not under threat from, well, one can always make that case. See, one can always make the case that we're under a racial war from the whites, or a racial war from the blacks, or whatever it may be. One can always make that case. Then one always has a reason for the disabusing of these rights. Now, whether or not it's a right to publish on YouTube, I mean, that's another question. But either way, we're seeing this extension. Like, you're no longer allowed to talk about being anti-vax. You're no longer allowed to put positions forward. Well, what about Geert Vanderbosch, I believe his name is, who has who's a virologist or was a vaccine developer or is at least heavily tied to that. And he's no longer allowed to put out YouTube videos. And if I want to have a debate on my channel between someone who's a pro-vaccine person and an anti-vaccine person, I can't have that because that'll be seen as being anti-vax. I mean, it could be globally dangerous in the sense that who knows if what we're doing with vaccinations is nourishing for all of society. I don't know. I'm not making a case either way. I'm saying that it would be great to be able to investigate this, and YouTube is a huge platform, but we're not allowed to. Why? Because precedent has been set from these other issues, like the issues of the quote-unquote radical left, which seems like it's just an offshoot of some obscure philosophies that are relegated to the ivory tower, but it's not just that.
I'm just remembering a scene in the film where one of the people basically says, this is not a debate. And you kind of go through, a number of situations where it's clear that the people that espouse this ideology have no interest in having the sort of discourse that you're describing.
Yeah, and you can also see that, well, where will that lead? In Cambodia, I believe it was in Cambodia, there wouldn't be trials because if you already believe the person to be guilty, now this sounds like, well, Curt, hey, you're drawing a huge line there. But at least that's what we're doing in the cognitive realm. We're saying that, no, that doesn't even, I'm not even going to allow you to make the case. So I'm not going to allow you to have a lawyer for the other side. And the lawyer, in this case, being an analogy for you to come up with justifications for your argument that perhaps it's not racism per se that's the problem. Perhaps it is. Perhaps it's partly that, but perhaps it's also partly the perception of racism, which is espoused by people from the academy. And we also know that there's plenty of data that suggests that if you believe that there's racism and sexism, you're going to perform worse. So you see plenty of articles right now that say racism is a mental health crisis because it gives at least modicums of something that's like post-traumatic stress disorder, or may in fact give full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder to people who have experienced racism severely. And I see almost no articles exploring, well, what are the consequences of telling someone that they're in a racist society when they may not be? Well, just telling them this. And there are studies that have been done. I'm just saying they're not popularized. There are studies that if you take people, so set people up into two different groups, and you say to one group, just so you know, the examiner is sexist, or this test is sexist, or this test is racist, or the examiner is racist. Then they perform, the people who are members of this minority group, if you even want to call women a minority, even though they're 50%, if you want to call them a minority, they perform worse. Okay, well, what effect does that have on someone's mental health? And I'm just saying that that's not explored. It's like you can't explore the other side without being called racist. What I'm saying right now will be called, and has been called, racist and white supremacist by people who are part of the radical left.